At my daughter's wedding, my son-in-law labeled my chair the poor old man who was only invited out of pity. Everyone laughed. My daughter stayed silent. I just dropped my gift and left when they opened the box on their honeymoon. They had a surprise. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Adam, and I'm 63 years old. I never thought I'd spend my daughter's wedding day feeling like a stranger in my own family. But that's exactly what happened on that crisp October afternoon. The venue was stunning. A 5-star resort with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and floral arrangements that probably cost more than I make in 3 months. Riley had always dreamed of a fairy tale wedding, and Christian, her new husband, made sure she got exactly that. Everything was perfect, elegant, expensive. Everything except my presence there. I arrived wearing my best suit, the same navy blue one I'd worn to job interviews and church services for the past 8 years. It wasn't designer, but it was clean and pressed. I'd even gotten a haircut the day before, wanting to look respectable for my little girl's big day. When I walked through those ornate doors, I felt nervous but proud. This was Riley's moment, and despite everything between us, I was grateful to be included. The check-in table was staffed by a young woman with a practiced smile who looked like she belonged in this world of wealth and sophistication. "Name, please?" she asked politely. "Adam Mitchell, father of the bride." She scanned her list, found my name, and handed me a small card. That's when my heart sank. Instead of just my name, the card read, "The old poor man who was only invited out of politeness." I stared at it, reading it twice to make sure I wasn't mistaken. The words seemed to burn into my retinas. My hand started shaking slightly, but I forced myself to stay calm. This had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe a mix-up with someone else's place card. "Excuse me," I said quietly to the young woman. "I think there might be an error with my card." She glanced at it and her cheeks flushed red. "I'm so sorry. Sir, let me check with the wedding planner." But before she could move, I heard a familiar laugh behind me. Christian appeared, impeccably dressed in his designer tuxedo, his smile wide and cruel. No mistake there. "Adam," he said loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "that's exactly where you belong." A group of well-dressed people nearby turned to look, and I felt their eyes studying me, taking in my off-the-rack suit, my worn shoes, my calloused hands. Christian's friends, young professionals with expensive watches and perfect teeth, started chuckling. "Christian," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady, "this is your wedding day. Let's not what?" He stepped closer, his voice carrying that tone he used whenever he wanted to put me in my place. "Pretend you're something you're not. Come on. Adam, everyone here knows exactly what you are." More guests gathered around us. Drawn by the commotion, I recognized some of Riley's college friends, Christian's family members, people from their social circle. They were all looking at me like I was some kind of curiosity, an oddity that had somehow wandered into their perfect world. "Ladies and gentlemen," Christian announced with theatrical flair, "I present to you Adam Mitchell, the man who raised my wife while working as a janitor. Isn't it sweet how we included him today?" The laughter that followed felt like physical blows. These people, strangers to me but part of my daughter's new life, were laughing at me, at my life, at everything I'd worked for. But what hurt most was seeing Riley in the crowd, beautiful in her white gown, saying nothing. She just stood there, her face flushed with what I could only assume was embarrassment. "Riley," I called out to her, hoping she'd step forward. "Tell Christian to stop." Defend her father the way I'd defended her countless times throughout her life. But she looked away. That moment of silence stretched between us like an ocean. My daughter, the little girl I'd raised alone, the one I'd sacrificed everything for, couldn't even look at me while her new husband humiliated me in front of a room full of strangers. Christian's mother, Margaret, approached with that superior smile she always wore around me. "Oh, Adam, Don't take it personally, Christian just has such a wonderful sense of humor. It's not humor when it's designed to hurt someone, I replied, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. Hurt? Christian laughed. Come on, Adam, we all know you're used to being the underdog by now. The crowd erupted in more laughter. Someone in the back called out, "At least he's honest about it," another person added. That's what I call keeping it real. I felt something break inside me, not anger, not rage, just a quiet, devastating understanding. This wasn't about my financial situation or my job or my clothes. This was about respect, and I realized I'd never had theirs. I'd been fooling myself, thinking that loving Riley was enough, that being a good father mattered more than having money in the bank. But looking at my daughter's face, seeing how she couldn't bring herself to defend me, I understood that I'd lost her a long time ago, somewhere between her teenage years, when she started comparing our small apartment to her friends' houses, and now, when she'd chosen a man who thought it was acceptable to humiliate her father at their wedding. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the gift I'd brought, a small, elegantly wrapped box that had taken me 3 months of careful saving to afford. I'd chosen it specifically for this moment, for this day that was supposed to celebrate love and family. Without saying another word, I walked over to the gift table and placed it among the other presents. The box looked modest compared to the expensive packages surrounding it, but I knew what was inside mattered more than its appearance. Christian was still making jokes behind me, his voice carrying across the reception area. I wondered what the poor old man brought. Probably something from the dollar store. More laughter followed. But I didn't turn around. I couldn't bear to see Riley's face again. Couldn't stand to watch her choose her new family over the one who'd raised her. As I walked toward the exit, I heard Christian call out, "Leaving so soon, Adam? The party's just getting started." I stopped at the door and turned back one final time. Riley was looking at me now, and for just a moment, I thought I saw something in her eyes, regret maybe, or recognition of what was happening. But Christian put his arm around her waist and whispered something in her ear that made her look away again. "Enjoy your wedding," I said, my voice carrying further than I'd intended. "And enjoy your gift. I think you'll find it very educational." Then I walked out into the crisp October air, leaving behind the laughter, the luxury, and the daughter who'd chosen to let her father be humiliated on what should have been the happiest day of both our lives. The drive home was quiet. I didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't even turn on the radio. I just drove through the familiar streets of my neighborhood, past the small houses and modest cars, back to the world where I belonged. But for the first time in years, I wasn't ashamed of it, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away with your dignity intact, even when your heart is breaking, especially when your heart is breaking. The morning after the wedding, I sat in my small kitchen with a cup of coffee, staring out the window at the apartment complex parking lot. The events of the previous day played over and over in my mind. But they weren't the only memories haunting me. Christian's cruel words had opened a door to the past, and now I couldn't stop the flood of recollections that came pouring through. Riley was only 8 when her mother died. Cancer took Susan quickly one day. She was complaining of fatigue. 6 months later, I was standing beside her hospital bed, holding her hand as she slipped away. Riley didn't understand why Mommy couldn't come home, why I cried when I thought she wasn't looking, why our house suddenly felt so empty and quiet. I remember the morning I realized how much everything was going to change. I was sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by medical bills that seemed to multiply every day. Susan's insurance had covered most of the treatment, but still left us with $37,000 in debt. The funeral expenses added another $8,000. Our savings account, which had taken us 12 years to build, was completely wiped out. That's when I made the first sacrifice. Though I didn't think of it that way at the time, I sold my landscaping business, the one I built from nothing, working 18-hour days and weekends to create something I could be proud of. It was profitable, growing, Everything I dreamed of when I started it with a used pickup truck and a few basic tools. The buyer offered me $68,000, which was fair, but still less than what I knew it was truly worth. I took it anyway because Riley needed stability. And I needed to pay off those medical bills, just like that. 15 years of building something from the ground up was gone. Riley was too young to understand what I'd given up. All she knew was that Daddy didn't go to work in his truck anymore, didn't come home with dirt under his fingernails and stories about the gardens he was creating. Instead, I started working at Mason Elementary School as a custodian. The pay was less than half what I'd been making, but it had benefits, and more importantly, it meant I could be there when Riley got out of school for the first few years. She didn't seem to mind. We'd walk home together, her small hand in mine, talking about her day, her friends, her teachers. We'd stop at the park sometimes or the library, making those small moments stretch as long as possible. Money was tight, but we had each other. And I thought that was enough. But kids grow up and they start noticing things. Rayleigh was 12 when it first happened. She'd been invited to a birthday party at Chelsea Morrison's house, a massive colonial in the wealthy part of town. I drove her there in my 10-year-old Honda, feeling self-conscious as we pulled up behind a row of luxury SUVs and sports cars. When I picked her up 3 hours later, Riley was quiet during the drive home. Finally, she asked, "Dad, why don't we live in a house like Chelsea's?" I tried to explain that different families had different circumstances, that what mattered was that we loved each other and had everything we needed. But I could see in her eyes that my words weren't enough. She'd seen another world that day, a world of marble countertops and swimming pools, and parents who didn't have to worry about the electric bill. The questions kept coming after that. Why couldn't we go on vacation like the Johnson family? Why didn't I wear suits to work like Emma's dad? Why was our car so old? Why did we live in an apartment instead of a house? Each question felt like a small knife, not because Riley was being cruel. She was just a curious child trying to understand her place in the world. But because I knew the answers, knew exactly what I'd given up and why. And I couldn't explain it to her without burdening her with adult worries she shouldn't have to carry. High school made everything worse. Rayleigh's friends came from families with money, doctors, lawyers, business owners. They wore expensive clothes, drove nice cars, went on spring break trips to Cancun and Europe. Riley started working part-time at a coffee shop. Not because I asked her to, but because she was tired of being the poor kid in her group. I'll never forget the night she came home from work, threw her apron on the kitchen counter, and looked at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm embarrassed, Dad," she said, and those words cut deeper than any physical pain I'd ever experienced. "Emma's parents are taking everyone to dinner at Le Bernardin next weekend for her birthday, and I can't afford to go. Do you know how that feels to have to tell your friends you can't afford a dinner?" I wanted to tell her that I understood embarrassment better than she knew, that I felt it every time I had to use coupons at the grocery store, while her friends' parents shopped. Without looking at prices, I wanted to explain that I'd given up my business, my dreams, my financial security, so that she could have stability after losing her mother. But instead, I just held her while she cried the next morning. I took a second job, weekend maintenance work at a local mall, mopping floors and emptying trash cans while families with children Riley's age walked past me like I was invisible. I used that extra income to make sure Riley could participate in her friends' activities, could go to those expensive dinners and weekend trips. I told myself it was temporary, just until she graduated. But graduation brought new challenges. Riley had been accepted to medical school, her dream since she was 14. The tuition was staggering, $53,000 per year, not including living expenses, books, and supplies. Even with financial aid and student loans, we were looking at a shortfall of nearly $30,000. That's when I made the biggest sacrifice of all, though once again, Riley never knew the full extent of it. I had kept one thing from my old business, a commercial property I'd bought years earlier, intending to expand my landscaping operation after Susan's death. I'd held on to it, partly for sentimental reasons, and partly because it was steadily appreciating in value by Riley's senior year of college. It was worth nearly $200,000. I sold it to pay for her medical school education. The entire amount went directly to tuition, room and board and living expenses, so she could focus on her studies instead of working multiple jobs like I had at her age. She never had to take out additional loans, never had to worry about money while her classmates stressed about debt. Selling that property meant giving up my retirement security. It meant accepting that I'd probably be working as a custodian until I was too old or sick to continue. It meant watching my peers start thinking about retirement communities and travel plans while I calculated how many more years I needed to work just to survive. Riley graduated medical school debt-free and immediately landed a residency at a prestigious hospital. She was proud, successful, everything I dreamed she could become. But somewhere along the way, our relationship had shifted. She'd grown comfortable with the sacrifices I made, maybe even started to expect them, and she'd begun to see my modest lifestyle not as a choice I'd made for her benefit, but as a reflection of my limitations. When she started dating Christian during her residency, I could see the change in her immediately. He was everything I wasn't: wealthy, sophisticated, from a family that had never known financial struggle. He drove a BMW, wore expensive clothes, took Riley to restaurants I couldn't afford, even for special occasions. The first time I met him, I could see the judgment in his eyes. He looked around my small apartment, took in my secondhand furniture and bargain store dishes, and I watched him categorize me as someone beneath his social class. Riley saw it too, and instead of defending her father or explaining the circumstances that led to my modest lifestyle, she seemed embarrassed. That's when I realized that all my sacrifices had backfired. Instead of showing Riley the depth of a parent's love, I'd accidentally taught her that I was less valuable than other people's parents. Instead of demonstrating strength and resilience, I'd convinced her that I was simply unsuccessful. The irony was painful. I'd given up everything to give her the best possible life, and in doing so, I'd made myself appear worthless in her eyes. But Christian didn't know the whole story. Riley didn't know the whole story. And tomorrow, when they opened that small gift box during their honeymoon, they'd finally understand exactly what kind of man they'd chosen to humiliate. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come wrapped in the smallest packages. Riley and Christian had chosen Santorini for their honeymoon, a week at a luxury resort overlooking the Aegean Sea. The wedding gifts had been shipped ahead to their suite, and Christian was particularly excited about opening them. He'd made a point of inviting several wealthy family friends to the wedding, and he was eager to see what expensive presents they'd brought. They'd been married for 3 days. When they finally decided to tackle the pile of elegantly wrapped boxes stacked in their suite sitting area, Riley poured champagne while Christian organized the gifts by size, saving what he assumed were the most expensive ones for last. "This is like Christmas morning," Christian said, grinning as he picked up a large box from Tiffany & Co. "Your father's little contribution is over there somewhere. We should probably open that one first, get it out of the way." Riley felt a slight twinge of discomfort at Christian's dismissive tone, but she didn't say anything. She'd learned over the past year that it was easier to let Christian's comments about her father slide rather than start an argument. The small box Adam had left at the wedding was sitting apart from the others, wrapped in simple brown paper with Riley's name written in her father's careful handwriting. It looked almost pitiful next to the elaborate packages from Christian's family and friends. "I still can't believe he had the nerve to stay after that stunt you pulled with the place card," Riley said, trying to inject some humor into the moment. Christian laughed, unwrapping a crystal vase from one of his business associates. That was pretty brilliant, wasn't it? Did you see his face? I thought the old man was going to cry. Riley had seen her father's face, and the memory of it made her stomach clench uncomfortably. But she pushed the feeling aside and reached for Adam's gift. Let's just see what he brought and move on. The wrapping paper came off easily, revealing a plain cardboard box about the size of a jewelry case. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were 3 items: a sealed manila envelope marked "Important Read First," a small leather journal, and what appeared to be a brass key attached to a ring. "What is all this junk?" Christian asked, leaning over to look. "Did he clean out his junk drawer for our wedding gift?" Riley opened the envelope and pulled out several documents. The first was a handwritten letter from her father, dated just 2 weeks before the wedding. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to read aloud. "My dearest Riley, if you're reading this, it means you've finally opened my gift by now. You and Christian are probably wondering why your poor old father gave you what looks like a collection of random items. The truth is, these aren't random at all. They represent a secret. I've kept from you for most of your life, a secret I maintain to protect you from people who might want to hurt you or use you for your family's wealth." Riley stopped reading. Her brow furrowed. What is he talking about? What wealth? Christian snatched the letter from her hands and continued reading. "The brass key opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box number 847. Inside that box, you'll find documents that will explain everything the leather journal contains. A record of all my financial transactions over the past 15 years, including the sale of properties and investments that I've hidden from everyone, including you." "This is ridiculous," Christian muttered. But his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Your father's a janitor. What kind of properties could he possibly own?" Riley took the letter back and kept reading. "I know you've been embarrassed by my lifestyle, by my job, by what you perceived as my failure to provide you with the kind of life your friends enjoyed. What you didn't know is that everything, the modest apartment, the old car, the simple clothes, was an act I've been testing the people around you, especially anyone who showed romantic interest in you. I needed to know if they loved you for who you are, or if they were attracted to what they thought you might inherit someday." Christian's face had gone pale. "This can't be real. He's making this up." But Riley was staring at the documents beneath the letter. Bank statements, property deeds, stock certificates. Her hand shook as she spread them across the coffee table. The numbers were staggering. "Christian," she whispered, "look at this. This says he owns rental properties in downtown worth $12 million, and this stock portfolio, it's valued at over $800,000. Christian grabbed the documents, his eyes scanning them frantically. "These have to be fake. How would a janitor get this kind of money?" Riley found another document in the pile, a business sale agreement from 15 years earlier. He sold his landscaping business for $68,000 right after Mom died. "But look at this." He pointed to additional paperwork. "He used that money to buy these properties. When the market crashed, he's been collecting rent on them ever since." The leather journal told an even more detailed story. Adam had meticulously recorded every financial decision he'd made since Susan's death: the sale of his landscaping business, the purchase of undervalued real estate during the recession, the careful reinvestment of rental income into stocks and bonds, the gradual accumulation of wealth that he'd hidden from everyone. But the most shocking entries were from the past 2 years. Detailed notes about Christian's behavior and comments about money. "Listen to this," Riley said, reading from the journal March 15th. "Christian asked Riley if I had any life insurance policies when she said she didn't know. He suggested she find out for planning purposes April 3rd. Christian made a comment at dinner about how it's sad that some parents can't leave their children anything April 20th. Christian asked if I owned the apartment or rented it, when Riley said, I rented. He seemed relieved. Christian tried to grab the journal, but Riley pulled it away. There's more. May 10th. Christian offered to help me manage my finances and suggested I might be eligible for government assistance programs. He actually gave me a pamphlet about food stamps. Christian. Food stamps. I was trying to help, Christian said weakly, but his voice lacked conviction. Riley kept reading, her voice growing stronger and angrier with each entry. June 2nd. Christian told Riley she should encourage me to move into a senior living facility because old people do better with structure and supervision. June 18th. Christian said I should consider signing over power of attorney to Riley so she could make sure I'm taken care of properly as I get older. Christian stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. This is insane. Your father is clearly delusional. He's making up stories to justify his failure. But Riley was staring at a bank statement dated just 1 week before the wedding. The account balance showed $21 million. Christian, this isn't made up. Look at these bank statements. They're official documents from First National Bank. She found another letter at the bottom of the envelope. This one addressed to both of them. Riley and Christian, I hope by now you understand that I've been living a carefully constructed lie for the past 15 years. Every decision I made, the job I took, the apartment I rented, the clothes I wore, was designed to test the character of the people in your life. I wanted to make sure that when you fell in love, it would be with someone who valued you for your heart, not your potential inheritance. Christian stopped pacing and slowly turned around. What does that mean? Riley continued reading. Christian, you failed that test spectacularly. Not only did you consistently show contempt for what you believed was my poverty, but you actively tried to manipulate the situation for your own benefit. I have recordings of our conversations, including the one where you offered to take care of my finances in exchange for being named in my will. Recordings? Christian's voice cracked. What recordings? Riley reached into the box and pulled out a small digital recorder that she'd missed before. We pressed play, and her father's voice filled the room, followed by Christian's. Mr. Mitchell, I know this might seem forward, but Riley and I have been talking about the future, and we're concerned about your financial situation. What kind of concerns, Christian? Well, you're getting older, and managing money can become difficult. I work in financial services, so I understand these things. If you were to sign over power of attorney to Riley, or even better to me since I have the professional experience, we could make sure your money is properly managed. I don't have much money to manage, son, I understand. But even small amounts need proper oversight, and if something were to happen to you, well, it would be good to have everything arranged beforehand. Maybe we could talk about updating your will. I could help you draft something that would protect Riley's interests. The recording went on for another 10 minutes, with Christian becoming increasingly bold in his suggestions. He talked about streamlining Adam's assets, suggested that Adam might want to gift money to Riley before he died to avoid taxes, and even offered to move Adam into a nice facility where he'd be properly cared for. Riley's hands were shaking as she turned off the recorder. Christian, you were trying to steal from my father. I was trying to help your family plan for the future, Christian protested. But his face was flushed with guilt. You thought he was poor. You thought he had nothing, and you were still trying to manipulate him into giving you control of his finances. The final document in the envelope was a copy of Adam's actual will. Riley read it with growing amazement. Her father had left everything to her. The properties, the stocks, the bank accounts, all of it. But there was a condition. She would only inherit if she was unmarried, or if her spouse passed a character evaluation that Adam would conduct personally. There's a note attached to the will, Riley said, her voice barely above a whisper. It says, if I married someone who failed his test, I would have 1 year to divorce them before the inheritance would be donated to charity instead. Christian sank onto the couch, his face buried in his hands. This can't be happening. Your father is just a janitor. Janitors don't have millions of dollars. But as Riley looked at the evidence spread across the coffee table, the bank statements, The property deeds, the stock certificates, the recorded conversations. She realized that everything she'd believed about her father was wrong. He wasn't a failure who had been unable to provide for his family. He was a man who'd sacrificed his public reputation to protect his daughter from exactly the kind of person she'd married, the man who had raised her, who'd worked multiple jobs to pay for her education, who'd lived modestly so she could have everything she needed, had been testing her judgment all along. And she'd failed that test as completely as Christian had failed his. The worst part wasn't discovering that her father was wealthy. The worst part was realizing that she'd been embarrassed by a man who'd loved her enough to pretend to be poor just to keep her safe. And now, sitting in a luxury suite overlooking the Mediterranean, surrounded by wedding gifts from people who barely knew her, Riley finally understood what her father had been trying to protect her from. She'd married exactly the kind of man he'd been afraid she would meet. The rest of their honeymoon was ruined. Christian spent hours on the phone with lawyers trying to determine if there was any way to contest Adam's will or force Riley to claim her inheritance. Despite the conditions, Riley sat on their balcony, staring at the Azure Sea while her world crumbled around her. "You have to call him," Christian said for the 20th time that day, pacing behind her chair. "You have to apologize and fix this." Riley didn't respond. She was reading through her father's journal again, discovering more entries about Christian's behavior that she'd missed the first time. Each page revealed another instance of her husband's attempts to manipulate her father. Another moment when Christian had shown his true character while she'd been blind to it. "Riley, are you listening to me? We're talking about $2 million here. You can't just throw that away because your feelings are hurt." She turned to look at him. Really look at him. For the first time since they'd opened the gift, his face was flushed, his hair disheveled from running his hands through it constantly. The charming, confident man she'd fallen in love with had disappeared, replaced by someone desperate and grasping. "When did you first find out about my father's financial situation?" she asked quietly. Christian stopped pacing. "What do you mean?" "I just found out, same as you." "No. Christian, I've been reading his journal. He has detailed notes about every conversation you two had. He knew you were investigating his finances. The question is, how long have you known he had money?" Christian's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." Riley stood up and walked back into the suite, picking up the journal. March 23rd. She read aloud. "Christian asked the building superintendent about my rent payments. When told that I pay 6 months in advance, he seemed surprised and asked if I had family money." April 7th. "Christian drove by the elementary school where I work and took pictures of my car. When he mentioned to me that I drive an unusually reliable vehicle for someone in my situation, I realized he was building a profile." Christian sat down heavily on the couch. "Okay. Fine, I noticed some things that didn't add up. You can't blame me for being curious." May 15th. Riley continued reading. "Christian hired a private investigator to look into my background. The investigator found records of my landscaping business sale, but missed the property purchases because they were made through an LLC. Christian seemed disappointed by the report and asked if there was more digging to be done. "You hired a private investigator to spy on my father?" Rayleigh's voice was incredulous. "I was protecting you." Christian's desperation was showing now. "I needed to make sure he wasn't hiding debts or problems that might affect our future together." Riley laughed bitterly. "You were protecting me from what? From having a father who might leave me money?" He kept flipping through the journal, finding more damaging entries. July 4th. At the barbecue, Christian told my neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, that he was worried about my declining mental state and asked if she'd noticed any signs of dementia. When she said I seemed sharp as ever, he suggested that sometimes these things are subtle and that family members need to watch out for early signs. Christian buried his face in his hands. "I was genuinely concerned. Older people can be vulnerable." July 20th. Rayleigh's voice was getting louder now. Christian researched guardianship laws in our state and printed out forms for declaring an adult mentally incompetent. He left the papers in his briefcase during a visit, apparently hoping I would see them and begin to doubt my own mental capacity. This is insane. Christian muttered, "Your father's making things up." But Riley found photos tucked into the back of the journal. Pictures of Christian going through Adam's mail, of him talking to the building superintendent, of him meeting with someone who was clearly the private investigator he'd hired. Her father had been documenting everything. He knew, Riley said. The full realization hitting her. He knew from the beginning that you were investigating him. That's why he played along. That's why he acted poorer than he was. We found another section of the journal labeled Testing Phase. The entries detailed how Adam had deliberately given Christian opportunities to show his character and how Christian had failed every single test. August 12th. I told Christian that I was having trouble paying for my blood pressure medication, instead of offering to help or suggesting we look into assistance programs together. He immediately started asking about my health insurance and whether I had long-term care coverage. He seemed particularly interested in whether I'd need to be hospitalized anytime soon. Christian stood up abruptly. I was trying to help you plan for your father's medical needs. August 30th, Riley continued, her voice shaking with anger. Christian offered to take me to lunch and spent the entire meal asking about my estate planning. He suggested I might want to consider moving in with him and Riley, ostensibly for health reasons, but kept steering the conversation toward finances. He offered to help me organize my important papers and seemed frustrated when I declined. The journal entries painted a picture of systematic manipulation that had been going on for over a year. Christian had been probing, investigating, and positioning himself to take advantage of what he thought was an elderly man's vulnerability. But the most damaging entries were yet to come. September 15th. Christian brought a locksmith to my apartment building, claiming he was concerned about my safety and thought I might benefit from better locks when I wasn't home. He had the locksmith install new locks and kept a spare key for emergencies. I found out because the superintendent thought it was suspicious and called me. Riley stared at Christian in horror. You had locks installed on my father's apartment without his permission. He's getting older. What if he had a medical emergency and we couldn't get in to help him? October 3rd, Riley read, her voice deadly quiet. Now Christian used the spare key to enter my apartment while I was at work. My hidden security camera recorded him going through my desk, photographing documents, and searching through my bedroom closet. He spent particular time examining my checkbook and looking for any hidden valuables or important papers. Christian's face had gone from white to gray. I was worried about you. Old people sometimes hide things or forget where they put important documents. But Riley wasn't finished. The final entries were the most damaging of all. October 20th. Christian brought a lawyer to meet me for coffee, introducing him as a friend who specializes in elder law. The lawyer spent an hour trying to convince me that I should have a will, should consider signing power of attorney over to a family member, and should think about what would happen if I became incapacitated. Christian sat there nodding along, occasionally adding comments about how responsible adults plan for these things. November 5th. Christian presented me with legal documents he'd had drawn up, including a power of attorney agreement that would give him control over my finances in case something happens. He assured me it was just a precaution and that I could revoke it any time. But the fine print made it much more difficult to cancel than he indicated. Riley looked up from the journal, tears streaming down her face. You tried to trick my father into signing over power of attorney to you. My father, who you thought was a poor janitor with probably a few thousand in savings. Christian was quiet for a long moment. Then he exploded. So what if I did? Your father is old. Someone needs to look out for his interests. His interests are your interests. Our interests. Riley, I was thinking about our future together. Riley found the final entry in the journal, dated just 1 week before the wedding. November 28th, Christian made his final move today. He presented me with an updated will that he'd had a lawyer prepare, suggesting that I should leave everything to Riley. But with him as the executor of the estate, he explained that this would simplify things and ensure that Riley wouldn't be burdened with legal complications if something happened. To me, the will contained clauses that would give him significant control over any inheritance, including the ability to manage Riley's inheritance for her own good. When I asked questions about specific provisions, he became impatient and suggested that I was overthinking things. He actually said, "Adam, you don't have enough assets for this to be complicated. Just sign the papers." Riley set the journal down and looked at her husband. She really looked at him. This was the man she'd married. This was the man who had spent over a year systematically trying to manipulate and control her father, believing he was taking advantage of a vulnerable elderly person with limited means. "The worst part," she said quietly, "isn't that you tried to steal from him? The worst part is that you tried to steal from someone you thought was poor and defenseless." Christian's desperation reached a new level. "Riley, you're not thinking clearly. This is $2 million we're talking about. Do you know what we could do with that money? We could buy a house, invest in my business, travel the world. We could have everything we've ever wanted." "We?" "Yes, we. You're my wife." Riley stood up and walked to the suite's window, looking out at the Mediterranean. She thought about her father working 2 jobs to pay for her medical school while sitting on a fortune that could have made both their lives easier. She thought about the modest apartment he lived in, the old car he drove, the simple clothes he wore, all while Christian mocked him and tried to manipulate him. "I want you to call him," Christian said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "I want you to apologize and ask him to forgive us. Tell him it was all a misunderstanding." Riley turned around slowly. "Us? Riley, we're married. We're a team. We face this together." She looked at the man she'd promised to love and honor, the man who had spent their honeymoon calculating how to steal money from her father, and she realized that she'd never really known him at all. "I'm going to call him," she said quietly, "but not to apologize for us. To apologize for me, for allowing you to treat him the way you did, for choosing someone who could humiliate my father at my own wedding." Christian's face lit up with hope. "Good, yes, call him right now." Riley picked up her phone, but instead of calling her father, she dialed a different number. "Who are you calling?" Christian asked. "A lawyer." Riley replied, "I need to know what my options are for ending this marriage before I lose my inheritance to charity." Christian stared at her in shock as she began to speak to the attorney, discussing annulment procedures and the timeline for divorce in their state. The honeymoon was definitely over. But for Riley, it felt like she was finally waking up from a nightmare that had been disguised as a dream. Riley called her father 48 times over the next 3 days. Each call went straight to voicemail, and she left increasingly desperate messages. "Dad, please pick up. I need to talk to you, Dad. I found everything in the box. I understand now. Please call me back, Dad. I'm so sorry. I know I hurt you, and I know Christian hurt you. Please give me a chance to explain." By the 48th call, her voice was breaking. "Dad, I know you probably don't want to hear from me ever again, but I need you to know that I'm leaving. Christian, I'm filing for divorce as soon as we get back to the States. I should have defended you at the wedding. I should have stopped him from humiliating you. I was a coward, and I'm so ashamed of myself. Please just talk to me once, please." On the 49th call, Adam finally answered. "Hello, Riley." His voice was quiet, tired, but not angry. If anything, he sounded sad. And that was somehow worse than if he'd been furious. "Dad." Riley started crying immediately. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I found everything. The properties, the stocks, the recordings, all of it. I know what Christian was trying to do to you. I know you do. Sweetheart, the tenderness in his voice made her cry harder. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you explain what was happening? Adam was quiet for a long moment. Because I needed you to see it for yourself. If I told you that Christian was manipulating me, you would have defended him. You would have said I was being paranoid or jealous. You had to discover his character on your own. But I let him humiliate you at my wedding. I stood there and said nothing while he made fun of you in front of everyone. Yes, you did. The simple acknowledgement of her failure hit her like a physical blow. He'd been hoping he would minimize it. Tell her it wasn't that bad. Forgive her immediately instead. He was making her face the reality of what she'd done. I don't know how to fix this. She whispered, You can't fix it, Riley. You can learn from it. But you can't undo it. She could hear Christian in the background, frantically whispering, Tell him we want to work things out. Tell him we'll do whatever it takes. Riley turned away from her husband. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. How long have you been wealthy? I mean really wealthy, not just comfortable, Adam chuckled. But it wasn't a happy sound. I've been building wealth since your mother died. But I've been truly wealthy. The kind of wealthy that Christian was hoping for. For about 8 years, the real estate market recovery made the properties I bought worth significantly more than what I paid for them. 8 years. Riley repeated, doing the math in her head. That means you were already wealthy when I started medical school. Yes. You could have told me then. You could have stopped working as a janitor. You could have lived in a nice house, driven a good car, worn better clothes. I could have. But then I never would have learned who you really were. Riley felt her heart break a little more. What do you mean, Riley? Do you remember your senior year of medical school when you brought Christian home for the first time? She remembered it vividly. She'd been nervous about introducing Christian to her father, worried that he'd be embarrassed by their small apartment and her father's job. You spent the entire evening apologizing for me. Adam continued. You apologized for the apartment, for the furniture, for the food I cooked. You kept making excuses for why I was just a janitor. As if my job was something shameful. Riley closed her eyes, remembering she had done exactly that. But the worst part wasn't your embarrassment, sweetheart. The worst part was watching you choose Christian's opinion over your relationship with me. You saw how he looked at our home, at me, and instead of defending your father or telling him that my circumstances didn't define my worth, you sided with him. I didn't mean to. Yes, you did. You absolutely meant to. You made a choice that night about whose approval mattered more to you, mine or his, and you chose his. Riley could hear the pain in his voice, pain that had been building for years while she'd been oblivious to it. That's when I knew I needed to test him more seriously. Adam continued, because if you were going to marry someone who looked down on your father, I needed to know exactly what kind of person he was. The recordings, Riley said. Understanding. You started recording your conversations with him. After that, I started documenting everything, every conversation, every interaction, every attempt he made to manipulate me. I wanted to have proof of his character, not just my opinion of it. Riley thought about all the times over the past year when Christian had made comments about her father's situation or offered suggestions for helping him. He thought he was being thoughtful. Now she realized he'd been calculating. Dad, there's something else I need to tell you. Christian hired a private investigator to look into your finances. I know the investigator wasn't very good at his job. I caught him going through my mail twice. You knew? Riley, I've known about every move Christian has made for the past 18 months. The locksmith, the lawyer, the power of attorney documents. All of it. I let him think he was being clever while I documented everything. The full scope of her father's deception was staggering. While she and Christian had believed they were dealing with a vulnerable elderly man, Adam had been orchestrating an elaborate test of their character. Why go through all of this? Riley asked. Why not just tell me you had money and see how Christian reacted? Because I needed you both to reveal your true selves. If I told you I was wealthy, Christian would have pretended to be different. He would have been respectful and kind. At least in front of you. You would have married him thinking he was a good man who just happened to benefit from your family's money. Riley understood now, but by keeping the secret, you forced him to show you who he really was when he thought there was nothing to gain. Exactly, and sweetheart, what he showed me was terrifying. Christian didn't just try to take advantage of what he thought was a poor old man. He enjoyed it. He got pleasure from making me feel small and powerless. The way he talked to me, the way he looked at me, the way he dismissed everything I said. That wasn't just about money, that was about cruelty. Riley thought about the wedding, about the way Christian had laughed when the guests mocked her father, about how he'd seemed to enjoy the humiliation he was causing. There's more, Adam said quietly. Things I haven't told you yet, but things. Christian made contact with me 6 months before he proposed to you. He came to the school where I work and asked to speak with me privately. Riley's heart sank. What did he say? He told me that he loved you and wanted to marry you, but he was concerned about your financial future. He said he'd noticed that you sometimes helped me with expenses, and he wanted to make sure that I wouldn't be a burden on your marriage. A burden. He offered to pay for me to move into an assisted living facility. He said it would be better for everyone if I was somewhere I could get proper care, and it would give you and him privacy to start your life together. Riley felt sick. He tried to put you in a nursing home. He had brochures. Riley, he'd already researched facilities and had pricing information. He told me that you were too kind-hearted to suggest it yourself, but that you'd be happier if you knew I was being taken care of by professionals. When was this? 3 weeks before he proposed. He wanted me out of the picture before he asked you to marry him. Riley could hear Christian in the background, still trying to get her attention, still trying to manage the situation. The sound of his voice made her feel nauseated. Dad, I need you to know that I'm leaving him. I've already spoken to a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce. I know. Sweetheart, I hope you are. You hope I am. Riley, the fact that you called me 48 times is a good sign. The fact that you're angry about what Christian did is a good sign. But you've made a lot of choices over the past few years that have hurt me deeply. I need to know that you're changing because you understand. You were wrong. Not because you found out. I have money. The question cut to the heart of everything. Riley sat in the luxury hotel suite surrounded by expensive wedding gifts and forced herself to really examine her motivations. I don't know, she said finally. I'd like to think I would have seen Christian's true character eventually, even if you hadn't had money. But honestly, Dad, I think I was so blinded by his world, by his family's wealth and status, that I might have kept choosing him over you. Thank you for being honest, but I know now, and I know that the man who raised me, who sacrificed everything for my education and my future, deserves better than a daughter who's ashamed of him. I want to be better. Dad, I want to be the kind of person who would have defended you at that wedding, regardless of what anyone else thought. Adam was quiet for a long time when he finally spoke. His voice was softer. That's all I've ever wanted. Riley, I never cared if you knew about the money. I just wanted you to love me for who I am, not despite who I am. I do love you. I love you so much, and I'm so sorry I made you feel otherwise. I love you too, sweetheart. That's why this whole thing hurt so badly. Riley looked around the suite at the evidence of Christian's true nature spread across the coffee table. The journal entries, the recordings, the legal documents. Her husband had spent over a year trying to manipulate and control her father, and she'd been completely oblivious to it. Dad, can I come see you when I get back from Greece? Can we start over? We don't need to start over, Riley. We just need to move forward with honesty this time, for the first time in days. Riley smiled through her tears. I'd like that. After she hung up, Christian immediately started pestering her with questions about the conversation, trying to find some angle he could use to salvage the situation. But Riley wasn't listening anymore. She was thinking about her father, working 2 jobs while sitting on a fortune, letting Christian mock him and manipulate him, all to protect a daughter who hadn't been grateful enough to defend him when it mattered. She was thinking about the kind of person she wanted to be and the kind of person she'd married, and she was planning her escape 6 months after the divorce was finalized. I sat in my new living room reading the Sunday paper and sipping coffee from a mug Riley had given me for Father's Day. The mug said, "World's Best Dad," in simple black letters, nothing fancy. But it meant more to me than any expensive gift ever could. Riley knocked on the door at exactly 9 o'clock. Just like she had every Sunday morning for the past 4 months, she'd moved back to the city after the divorce, taking a position at the community hospital, where she could focus on helping people rather than building a prestigious career. The pay was less than what she'd made at the private practice, but she seemed happier than I'd seen her in years. "Morning, Dad," she said as I opened the door. She was carrying a bag of groceries and her medical bag. She'd been helping me manage my blood pressure medication, not because I needed the help, but because it gave her a way to take care of me that felt natural to both of us. "Morning, sweetheart. How was your week?" "Good, busy. I helped to deliver 3 babies and treated a man who thought he was having a heart attack, but it turned out he just had acid reflux from eating too much pizza." She smiled as she unpacked the groceries. "How about you? Any exciting adventures in property management?" I laughed after revealing my true financial situation. I'd stopped working as a janitor and began managing my investments and rental properties full-time. It was strange at first, living openly as the person I really was. But it felt good to stop pretending. "Mrs. Henderson in the Maple Street duplex wants me to install new kitchen cabinets. Apparently, the ones from 1987 are no longer adequate for modern living." Riley rolled her eyes. "Some people are never satisfied. But speaking of being satisfied, I have something to tell you." She sat down at the kitchen table, and I could see she was nervous about whatever she wanted to say. "Christian called me yesterday." I felt my jaw tighten involuntarily. "What did he want?" "He's getting married again to someone named Melissa, who comes from money, old money. Apparently, her family owns a chain of luxury hotels." I wasn't surprised. Christian had revealed himself to be exactly the type of man who would seek out wealth through marriage. "How do you feel about that?" Riley considered the question carefully. "I feel sorry for her, and I feel grateful that you love me enough to save me from spending my whole life with someone like that. Can you imagine if I'd had children with him? If I'd built a life around someone so fundamentally dishonest?" I could imagine it. And it was exactly what I'd been trying to prevent. Riley reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "He also sent me this. I think you should read it." I unfolded the paper and saw Christian's handwriting. "Riley, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry for how things ended between us. I've had time to think about what happened, and I realize now that I made mistakes. I hope you can forgive me, and that we can be friends. Also, I wanted to ask if there's any way you could put in a good word for me with your father. I know he was upset about some misunderstandings we had, but I'd like to clear the air with him. Maybe we could all have dinner sometime and talk things through. I think if he got to know the real me, he'd realize I'm not the person he thinks I am. Let me know if you're willing to help arrange something. Best wishes, Christian." I read it twice, then looked at Riley. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that the real him was exactly what my father thought he was, and that's why we got divorced." Riley's voice was calm but firm. "I also told him that you wouldn't be interested in having dinner with someone who tried to steal from you while pretending to be concerned about your welfare." "Good, Dad. Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you think I would have figured it out eventually about Christian? I mean, if you hadn't set up that test, if you hadn't documented everything he did, do you think I would have seen his true character on my own?" It was a question I'd asked myself many times over the past few months. "I think you would have seen it eventually," I said honestly, "but it might have taken years. And by then you might have had children with him, or become financially dependent on him, or gotten so tangled up in his family's expectations that it would have been much harder to leave." Riley nodded. I think about that sometimes. About how close I came to spending my whole life with someone who saw me as a means to an end, but you didn't. That's what matters now. She smiled and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. I have something else to tell you. I've been seeing someone. I raised an eyebrow. Oh. His name is David. He's a paramedic at the hospital. He drives a 10-year-old Honda and lives in a studio apartment. And he has no idea about your money or mine. And how does he treat you? Like I'm the most interesting person he's ever met. He asks about my work, remembers things I've told him about my patients, brings me coffee when I'm working late shifts. Last week, he spent his day off helping an elderly patient of mine fix her front steps because she couldn't afford to hire someone. I smiled. He sounds like a good man. He isn't, Dad. She looked at me seriously. I'd like you to meet him. But I want to do it right this time. I want him to know who you really are from the beginning. No tests. No pretending. No games. Just honesty. I'd like that very much. Riley got up and started making breakfast, moving around my kitchen like she belonged there. It was a scene I'd dreamed of during those years when we were estranged. When I'd worked my second job mopping floors at the mall while she lived her carefully curated life with Christian Dad. I need to tell you something else, she said as she scrambled eggs. I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately. Oh. I think she would have been proud of you for what you did. I mean, for protecting me, even when it meant letting me think badly of you for years. I felt my throat tighten with emotion. Susan had been the kindest person I'd ever known, but she'd also been fiercely protective of Riley. Your mother always said that being a parent sometimes means making choices that your children won't understand until they're older. She was right. Riley turned from the stove to face me. I understand now why you sold your business. After she died, I understand why you worked those extra jobs to pay for my education. I understand why you lived modestly even when you didn't have to. Everything you did was about giving me the best possible life. You were my whole world. Riley, you still are. She came over and hugged me, and I realized that this was the first time in years that she'd embraced me without any reservation or embarrassment. I love you, Dad, the real you, the janitor who worked nights to pay my tuition, and the property owner who's been secretly wealthy for 8 years. All of it. All of you. Later that afternoon, we drove to the cemetery to visit Susan's grave. It was something we'd started doing together recently, a way of including her memory in our rebuilt relationship. As we stood beside her headstone, Riley said, I think Mom would have liked David. Why? Because he reminds me of you, not the you that I was embarrassed by, but the you that I should have always seen. Someone who works hard, treats people with respect, and doesn't need money or status to feel good about himself. I put my arm around my daughter's shoulders. Your mother always said that character is what matters most. Everything else is just a decoration. She was right about that, too. As we walked back to the car, Riley said, Dad, I have one more confession to make. What's that? I kept one of the recordings from your journal, the one where Christian offered to put you in a nursing home. I was surprised. Why? Because I never want to forget how close I came to choosing the wrong person, and because sometimes when David does something kind or thoughtful, I play it to remind myself what the alternative could have been. I thought about that as we drove home through neighborhoods I'd known for decades, past the school where I'd worked as a janitor, past the apartment complex where I'd pretended to live modestly while building a fortune in secret. The test I designed for Christian had been cruel in its own way. I deliberately presented myself as vulnerable and powerless, then documented every attempt he made to take advantage of that perceived weakness. But it had worked exactly as I'd intended. It had revealed his true character in a way that no amount of polite conversation ever could have. More importantly, it had forced Riley to confront her own values and priorities. She'd had to choose between the life she'd built with Christian and the relationship with her father that she'd taken for granted that evening. As we sat on my porch watching the sunset, Riley said, "I have a proposal for you." "Oh, what kind of proposal?" "I want us to use some of your money and our money to do something meaningful together, maybe. Establish a scholarship fund for kids who can't afford college or support a program that helps elderly people avoid financial exploitation." I smiled. "That sounds like something your mother would have suggested." "I think she would have, and I think she would have wanted us to turn this whole experience into something positive." As the sun set behind the trees, I realized that my long, complicated test had accomplished something I'd never expected. It hadn't just revealed Christian's character or forced Riley to examine her priorities. It had brought my daughter and me closer together than we'd ever been. Sometimes the most painful lessons are also the most valuable ones, and sometimes the only way to save someone you love is to let them think they've lost you just long enough for them to understand what really matters. Riley was right. Her mother would have been proud not just of the outcome, but of the love that had made all the sacrifice and deception worthwhile. After all these years of pretending to be someone I wasn't, I was finally free to be myself, and for the first time since Susan died, I had my daughter back. Not the embarrassed young woman who'd chosen status over family, but the strong, compassionate woman she'd become after learning the hardest lesson of all. The gift I'd left at that wedding had been more than just documents and recordings. It had been the truth about Christian, about me, and about what really matters when everything else is stripped away. And sometimes the truth is the most valuable gift of all.